to interpretation.
Do you think there could be an experiment centered around consciousness? I mean, you're plugged into the neuroscience community. I think for the longest time, the quote unquote C word was totally not, was almost anti-scientific. But now more and more people are talking about consciousness. Elon is talking about consciousness. AI folks are talking about consciousness. It's still, nobody knows anything, but it feels like a legitimate domain of inquiry that's hungry for a real experiment.
So I have fortunately 3 short answers to this.
Right.
The first one is
2 hours later.
I'm not particularly succinct. I agree.
No,
the joke I always tell is there are 2 things you never want to say to a scientist. One is what do you do, and the second one is take as much time as you need. And you definitely don't want to say them in the same sentence. I have 3 short answers to it. So there's a cynical answer, kind of, and it's not one I enjoy giving, which is that if you look into the 70s and back at the 1970s and 1980s, and even into the early 2000s, there were some very dynamic, very impressive speakers who were very smart in the field of neuroscience and related fields, who thought hard about the consciousness problem and fell in love with the problem, but overlooked the fact that the technology wasn't there. Yeah. So I admire them for falling in love with the problem, but they gleaned tremendous taxpayer resources essentially for nothing. And these people know who they are. Some of them are alive, some of them aren't. I'm not referring to Francis Crick, who was brilliant, by the way, and thought the claustrum was involved in consciousness, which I think is a great idea. It's this obscure structure that no one's really studied. People are now starting to study it. So I think Francis was brilliant and wonderful. But there were books written about it. It makes for great television stuff and thought around the table or after a couple glasses of wine or whatever. It's an important problem nonetheless. And so I do think the consciousness, the issue is it's not operationally defined, right? That psychologists are much smarter than a lot of hard scientists in that, for the following reason. They put operational definitions. They know that psychology, if we're talking about motivation, for instance, they know they need to put operational definitions on that so that 2 laboratories can know they're studying the same thing. The problem with consciousness is no one can agree on what that is. And this was a problem for attention when I was coming up. So in the early 2000s, people would argue, what is attention? Is it spatial attention, auditory attention? And finally, people were like, you know what? We agree.
Have they agreed on that one?
Sort of.
I remember hearing people scream about attention.
Right. They couldn't even agree on attention. So I was coming up as a young graduate student. I'm thinking like, I'm definitely not going to work on attention. And I'm definitely not going to work on consciousness. And I wanted something that I could solve or figure out. I want to be able to see the circuit or the neurons. I want to be able to hear it on the audio. I want to record from it. And then I want to do gain of function and loss of function. Take it away, see something change, put it back, see something change in a systematic way. And that takes you down into the depths of some stuff that's pretty plug and chug, but, I'll borrow from something in the military because I'm fortunate to do some work with units from special operations, and they have beautiful language around things because their world is not abstract. Mm-hmm. And they talk about 3-meter targets, 10-meter targets, and 100-meter targets. And it's not an issue of picking the 100-meter target because it's more beautiful or because it's more interesting. If you don't take down the 3-meter targets and the 10-meter targets first, you're dead. So that's I think scientists could pay to adopt a more kind of military thinking in that sense. The other thing that is really important is that just because somebody conceived of something and can talk about it beautifully and can glean a lot of resources for it, doesn't mean that it's led anywhere. But this isn't just true of the consciousness issue. And I don't want to sound cynical, but I could pull up some names of molecules that occupied hundreds of articles in the very premier journals that then were later discovered to be totally moot for that process. And biotech companies folded, everyone, and the lab pivots and starts doing something different with that molecule. Mm-hmm. And nobody talks about it. Right. Because as long as you're in the game, we have this thing called anonymous peer review. You can't afford to piss off anybody too much unless you have some other funding stream. And I've avoided battles most of my career, but I pay attention to all of it. And I've watched this, and I don't think it's ego driven. I think it's that people fall in love with an idea. I don't think there's not enough money in science for people to sit back there rubbing their hands together. You know, the beauty of what Neuralink and Elon and team, because obviously he's very impressive, but the team as a whole is really what gives me great confidence in their mission, is that he's already got enough money, so it can't be about that. He doesn't seem to need it at a level of I don't know him, but he doesn't seem to need it at a kind of an ego level or something. I think it's driven by genuine curiosity, and the team that he's assembled include people that are very kind of abstract neocortex space-time coding people. They're people like Matt, who's a neurosurgeon. You can't BS neurosurgery. Yeah. Failures in neurosurgery are not tolerated. So you have to be very good to exceptional to even get through the gate. And he's exceptional. And then they've got people like Dan Adams, who was at UCSF for a long time, is a good friend and I've known him for years, who is very concrete, studied the vasculature in the eye and how it maps to the vasculature and cortex. When you get a team like that together, you're going to have dissenters. You're going to have people that are high-level thinkers, people that are coders. Yeah. When you get a team like that, it no longer looks like an academic laboratory or even a field in science. And so I think they're going to solve some really hard problems. And again, I'm not here. I have nothing at stake with them. But I think that's the solution. You need a bunch of people who don't need first author papers, who don't need to complete their PhD, who aren't relying on outside funding, who have a clear mission, and you have a bunch of people who are basically will adapt to solve the problem.
I like the analogy of the 3-meter target and the 100-meter target. So the folks at Neuralink are basically, many of them are some of the best people in the world at the 3-meter target. Like you mentioned Matt, neurosurgery, like they're solving real problems. There's no BS philosophical smoke some weed and look at the stars. But so both on Elon and because I think like this, I think it's really important to think about the 100-meter, and the 100-meter is not even 100-meter, but like like the stuff behind the hill that's too far away, which is where I put consciousness. Maybe I tend to believe that consciousness can be engineered. I mean, part of the reason, part of the business I want to build leverages that idea that consciousness is a lot simpler than we've been talking about.
Well, if someone can simplify the problem,
right,
that will be wonderful. I mean, the reason we can talk about something as abstract as face representations in fusiform face area is because Nancy Kanwisher had the brilliance to tie it to the kind of lower level statistics of visual scenes. It wasn't because she was like, oh, I bet it's there. Yep. That wouldn't have been interesting. So people like her understand how to bridge that gap, and they put a tractable definition. Right. So that's what I'm begging for in science is a tractable definition.
But I want people to sit I want people who are really uncomfortable with woo-woo, like consciousness, like high-level stuff, to sit in that topic and sit uncomfortably, because it forces them to then try to ground and simplify it into something that's concrete. Because too many people are just uncomfortable to sit in the consciousness room because there's no definitions. It's like attention or intelligence in the artificial intelligence community. But the reality is, it's easy to avoid that room altogether, which is what, I mean, there's analogies to everything you've said with the artificial intelligence community, with Minsky and even Alan Turing that talked about intelligence a lot. And then they drew a lot of funding and then it crashed because they really didn't do anything with it. And it was a lot of force of personality and so on. But that doesn't mean the topic of the Turing test and intelligence isn't something we should sit on and think like, what is, well, first of all, I mean, Turing actually attempted this with the Turing test. He tried to make concrete this very question of intelligence. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't linger on it. And we shouldn't forget that ultimately that is what our efforts are all about in the artificial intelligence community and in the people, whether it's neuroscience or whatever bigger umbrella you want to use for understanding the mind. The goal is not just about understanding layer 2 or 3 of the vision. It's to understand consciousness and intelligence and maybe create it, or just all the possible biggest questions of our universe. That's ultimately the dream.
Absolutely. And I think what I really appreciate about what you're saying is that everybody, whether or not they're working on a kind of a low-level synapse that's like a reflex in the musculature or something very high-level abstract, can benefit from looking at those who prefer everyone's going after 3 meter, 10 meter, and 100-meter targets in some sense, but to be able to tolerate the discomfort of being in a conversation where there are real answers, where the zeros and ones are known zeros and ones, are those the equivalent of that in the nervous system. And also, as you said, for the people that are very much like, oh, I can only trust what I can see and touch, those people need to put themselves into the discomfort of the high-level conversation, because what's missing is conversation and conceptualization of things at multiple levels. I think I don't gripe about, my lab's been fortunate. We've been funded from the start, and we've been happy in that regard, and lucky, and we're grateful for that. But I think one of the challenges of research being so expensive is that there isn't a lot of time, especially nowadays, for people to just convene around a topic, because there's so much emphasis on productivity. And so there are actually, believe it or not, there aren't that many formal concepts in neuroscience right now. The last 10 years has been this huge influx of tools. And so people have been neural circuits and probing around and connectomes, and it's been wonderful. Yeah. But 10, 20 years ago, when the consciousness stuff was more prominent, the C word, as you said, what was good about that time is that people would go to meetings and actually discuss ideas and models. Now it's sort of like demonstration day at the school science fair, where everyone's got their thing, and some stuff is cooler than others. But I think we're going to see a shift. I'm grateful that we have so many computer scientists and theoreticians and or theorists, I think they call themselves. Somebody tell me what the difference is someday. And psychology, and even, dare I say, philosophy. These things are starting to converge. Neuroscience, the name neuroscience, there wasn't even such a thing when I started graduate school or as a postdoc. It was neurophysiology, or you were a neuroanatomist, or what. Now, it's sort of everybody's invited, and that's beautiful. That means that something's useful is going to come of all this. And there's also tremendous work, of course, happening for the treatment of disease, and we shouldn't overlook that. That's where, eliminating, reducing suffering is also a huge initiative in neuroscience. So there's a lot of beauty in the field, but the consciousness thing continues to be it's like an exotic bird. It's like no one really quite knows how to handle it, and it dies very easily.
Well, yeah. So, I think also from the AI perspective, I view the brain as less sacred. I think from a neuroscience perspective, you're a little bit more sensitive to BS, like BS narratives about the brain or whatever. I'm a little bit more comfortable with just poetic BS about the brain, as long as it helps engineer intelligent systems. Well, what I mean?
And I have to, I confess ignorance when it comes to, most things about coding, and I have some quantitative ability, but I don't have strong quantitative leanings. And so I know my limitations too. And so I think the next generation coming up, a lot of the students at Stanford are really interested in quantitative models and theory and AI. And I remember when I was coming up, a lot of the people who were doing work ahead of me, I kind of rolled my eyes at some of the stuff they were doing, including some of their personalities, although I have many great senior colleagues everywhere.
Way of the world.
So it's the way of the world. So nobody knows what it's like to be a young graduate student in 2020, except the young graduate student. So I know I know there are a lot of things I don't know. And in addition to wanting to do a lot of public education, increase scientific literacy and neuroscientific thinking, et cetera, a big goal of mine is to try and at least pave the way so that these really brilliant and forward-thinking younger scientists can make the biggest possible dent and make what will eventually be all us old guys and gals look stupid. I mean, that's what we were all trying to do.
Goal.
That's what we were trying to do. So, yeah.